In the early morning heat of northern Mali, a truck rumbles out of Gao in 2013. Its cargo isn't food, fuel, or medicine. It's legal cigarettes, cartons stamped with familiar brand logos sold in Europe and North America. But these cigarettes are not headed for a shop shelf. They're headed deeper into territory controlled by armed groups. This is where ordinary commerce collides with lawlessness, where a legal product becomes a source of illicit revenue, and where the money from cigarette smuggling fuels conflict economies. This is the hidden story of how legal cigarette supply chains end up funding militias and insurgents in war zones around the world. Why cigarettes? Because they're valuable, easy to transport, and in many regions lightly regulated. A carton that costs $30 in a legal market can sell for $150 or more once it crosses a border illegally and evades taxes. In places without strong governance, that margin becomes irresistible. But the true cost isn't just lost tax revenue, it's the financing of armed conflict itself. To understand this, we need to follow the money and follow the cigarettes. In Afghanistan in the early 2000s, as the US-led invasion toppled the Taliban government, something unexpected began to emerge. Alongside opium and weapons trafficking, cigarette smuggling became a growing source of income for insurgent groups. Between 2003 and 2009, multiple investigative reports documented how legal cigarette brands produced in Pakistan and the Gulf states were transported across the porous Afghanistan-Pakistan border. At Taliban checkpoints, convoys were stopped, protection fees were paid in cash or shares of the load, and profits flowed back into the insurgency. Unlike opium, cigarettes didn't draw international narcotics policing, and unlike weapons, they didn't require sophisticated buyers. They were ordinary consumer products, but in these borderlands, their economic value outpaced their everyday use. Now consider West Africa, specifically the Sahel region. Between 2012 and 2017, Mali became a poster child for state collapse, as jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and later Islamic State seized territory in the north. They found themselves managing a burgeoning smuggling economy. Billions of cigarettes from coastal ports in Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal moved northward, far exceeding local legitimate demand. According to customs data analyzed by investigative consortia, up to 4.7 billion surplus cigarettes were being moved annually across borders with little to no oversight. These weren't counterfeit products, they were genuine brands manufactured for global markets. The reason they flooded the region wasn't accidental oversupply. It was the perfect storm of weak governance, high tax differentials, and organized networks willing to take the risk. Armed groups didn't run every smuggling cell, but they controlled the territory. That meant every shipment paid a toll. At each checkpoint, fees were levied. Trucks were stopped, scanned, and extorted. And the money collected didn't vanish into thin air. It was spent on fighters, weapons, food, and logistics. In some areas of northern Mali, local elders reported that Kel Tabak, the tobacco people, had become a permanent fixture of the war economy. And it didn't stop in Mali. In neighboring Niger and Burkina Faso, similar patterns emerged. Smugglers adapted routes, shifting eastwards as security forces tried to block one border crossing, opening another. In every case, the product was the same: legal cigarettes, destined for profit, moving through unregulated zones, funding violence by accident or design. To understand how this works, we have to look at the mechanics of the supply chain itself. Tobacco companies produce massive quantities of cigarettes, often far more than local markets can absorb. These products are distributed to wholesalers, retailers, and licensed sellers around the world. But when regulatory oversight is weak, when tracking is minimal and enforcement is sporadic, that surplus becomes liquid. Cartons can be bought cheaply, bundled together, and transported across borders, where taxes are higher and demand for cheaper smokes is strong. Here's the critical turning point: corruption. At every border crossing where law enforcement is underpaid, under-resourced, or complicit, there's an opportunity for bribery. A customs officer looking the other way. A border guard accepting cash for a sealed manifest. In places with foreign fighters and militias, the checkpoints aren't official at all. They're controlled by armed groups. In northeastern Nigeria, for instance, Boko Haram fighters use smuggling routes not just for arms and fighters, but for consumer goods, including cigarettes. As early as 2014, Nigerian security sources reported that illicit tobacco trade contributed millions of dollars annually to Boko Haram's treasury. The insurgent group taxed goods moving through territory it controlled, demanding fees that sometimes matched or exceeded official tariffs. Across the Sahara, in Libya after 2011, smuggling networks blossomed. When Muammar Gaddafi's regime fell, the state's customs and border controls collapsed too. Militias that filled the vacuum taxed every convoy passing through their turf. Legal goods, from fuel to cigarettes, became cash cows. Cigarette smuggling routes from Tunisia into Libya, and from Libya into Chad and Sudan, became entrenched, and the money collected kept militias funded even as international attention faded. It's important to be clear, smuggling itself isn't inherently violent, but in fragile states where armed actors control territory, smuggling becomes a revenue stream, and revenue fuels violence. The critical link is not the cigarettes, it's the profits and the power structures that control them. So how much money are we talking about? Globally, the illegal tobacco trade, which includes smuggling across borders to evade taxes, is estimated to be worth over $30 billion annually. That figure includes counterfeit products, but a significant portion is genuine brands sold illicitly. In regions like the Sahel or Afghanistan, even a fraction of that revenue represents a meaningful source of funding for armed groups. Tens of millions of dollars a year can feed fighters, pay bribes, and sustain campaigns that would otherwise lack financing. And it's not just insurgents. Organized crime networks in Eastern Europe and Central Asia have long traded in cigarette smuggling as a cash machine. In the 1990s and 2000s, as the Soviet Union dissolved, criminal syndicates exploited price differentials between former Soviet republics and European markets. The routes shifted over time, but the economic logic remained. Buy cheap, evade taxes, sell high, and split the profits. In Mexico too, cartels found cigarette smuggling profitable. Between 2010 and 2015, Mexican authorities reported that large shipments of legal cigarettes were being smuggled into the United States, avoiding taxes and generating millions in untraceable cash. While the focus was often on drug trafficking, tobacco was a quiet but potent side business, enriching criminal organizations and complicating enforcement efforts. How do enforcement agencies respond? Some countries have tried track and trace systems to monitor products from factory to retailer. Others impose harsher penalties for smuggling or increase border patrols. But in regions where there is no effective state presence, where armed groups operate with impunity, enforcement on paper rarely translates to action on the ground. New routes open as others are shut down. Smugglers adapt. Profits persist. Meanwhile, multinational tobacco companies have faced lawsuits and investigations alleging that their distribution practices contributed to the availability of their products in illicit markets. Companies argue that they don't control how products are resold once they leave the legal supply chain. But critics point out that massive oversupply in certain regions, weak monitoring, and lack of proactive compliance created fertile ground for smuggling. The legal product becomes indistinguishable from illicit goods once it's out of manufacturers' hands. Here's the human cost. In regions where armed groups fund themselves through smuggling, communities suffer. In northern Mali and Niger, villagers report extortion at militia checkpoints, threats to those who refuse to pay, and a cycle of fear that accompanies any trade route. In Afghanistan's borderlands, families caught between smugglers and insurgents live with forced levies and unpredictable violence. These are not abstract statistics. They are everyday realities for people living where the rule of law is absent. So, what does this mean for global security? First, it means that seemingly mundane global supply chains can have unintended consequences when they intersect with weak governance. Second, it means that efforts to curb militancy and insurgency can't ignore the economics, the way money moves, hides, and fuels conflict. And finally, it means that consumers, policymakers, and corporations alike need to grapple with the fact that legal products can become part of illicit finance networks in ways that matter. Because at the end of the day, cigarettes are more than a habit. In fragile states, they can be a financing engine for violence. The next time you see a familiar brand on the shelf, consider how that same product might be moving through unregulated roads, past armed checkpoints, funding fighters and fueling instability. This is not conspiracy. This is documented supply chain leakage. This is corruption and conflict economics. This is how legal commerce can feed war, and why understanding it matters today more than ever.